The International Monetary Fund, IMF, has announced that the $650 billion Special Drawing Rights, SDR, has been activated and allocation has started. And this is coming from a statement signed by the IMF Managing Director, now Kristalina Georgieva. The IMF Managing Director explained that this is the largest allocation of SDRs in history. The allocation is a significant shot in the arm for the world and, if used wisely, a unique opportunity to combat this unprecedented crisis. The SDR allocation will provide additional liquidity to the global economic system, supplementing countries' foreign exchange reserves and reducing their reliance on more expensive domestic or external debt. SDRs are being distributed to countries in proportion to their quota shares in the IMF. This means that about $275 billion is going to emerging and developing countries, of which low-income countries will receive about $21 billion, equivalent to as much as 6% of GDP in some cases. African nations will receive $33.6 billion in total from the new issuance of SDRs. The last SDR allocation was issued in 2009, following the global financial crisis. The African Union has been advocating for a global issuance of SDRs over the past year in hopes that countries can use these funds for the purchase of vaccines and other parts of national pandemic recoveries. This morning, we'll be looking at which African countries will get these facilities, how much, and possibly what these funds will be used for as we break down IMF Allocates Special Drawing Rights. I'm Tolulokwe Adeleru Balogun. Welcome. This is Business Edge. Joining me from Nairobi, Kenya is Ken Kichinga. He's the chief economist at Mentoria Economics, and he's going to take us through this issue. Ken, good afternoon to you. It is afternoon now in Nairobi, so thank you so much for joining us on Business Edge.
Thank you very much for having me.
All right, so let's start this conversation by establishing exactly what these special drawing rights are and what they consist of. So just give us a breakdown.
Yes, indeed. Well, the SDR, or the special drawing rights, are an asset by the IMF that are supposed to boost countries' ability to be able to trade amongst members of the IMF. This has come up over the last 50 years, and it's supposed to be a supplement to US dollars and gold, which have been the reserve currencies in most central banks.
All right, so now this new allocation by the IMF is worth about $650 billion, but the actual value is not necessarily in the exact dollar terms as stated. So how do SDRs get their value? What are they pegged against? Is it any value? Is it simply the US dollar? What does it take?
Well, that's a very good question, and it has been quite confusing for a number of analysts. Now, the SDR is not, in of itself, is not considered currency or money. You can't pay me in SDR. So it's considered a reserve asset in which only countries, and those countries have to be members of the fund, can be able to trade amongst themselves. And how the value is computed is they look at global trade and the dominant currencies in global trade, and they use that weighting to determine the value. So right now, the dollar controls about 40% of global trade, so it's given a 40% weighting. Then you have the euro, you have the Chinese yuan, the Japanese yen, and the GBP, the sterling pound, in those proportions. So those are the five basket of currencies that are used to compute the SDR.
Okay, so we've heard from the IMF, and they said that the SDR allocation is cost-free and does not add to a country's public debt. And a lot of people feel like this basically sort of means free money. And there are concerns about accountability and transparency. And you mentioned that this has sort of been in effect for the past 50 years. So looking back, what has been the level of transparency and accountability when countries previously accessed the previous allocations of the SDR?
Well, I think we have to take a step back and really understand how monetary policy has played out. If you look at the United States, as we speak right now, they're about to issue their fourth stimulus check of about $2,000 to each American citizen. In fact, one of the proposals in the US is to have a monthly paycheck of $2,000 to citizens every month until the pandemic is over. Now, most countries have been unable to pull off such monetary stimulus. In fact, the only stimulus available in most African countries has been on the fiscal side, in which debt repayments have been suspended for 6 months, but now they have restarted. So this is the way of the IMF saying if most of these African countries, most of the countries outside the US have been unable to deploy monetary stimulus, why don't they do it at the global level for all countries, so countries can have some level of liquidity to transact. The only difference though is in the US, the dollar is a currency and you can be able to pay for goods and services at the average citizen level. But with the SDR, really, these are going to be credits that will sit at the central bank. They will mostly be used for importation, and at this time, particularly importation of vaccines. So to the extent that they can really help countries in of themselves be able to transact within their domestic economies, it's still very, very limited. And that's why maybe the level of excitement has not been as much as you'd have expected.
And we'll get into that later on in terms of how much influence or how much impact SDRs can actually have on the economy. But let's look at some of the African countries that are going to receive. So according to reports, we see that it's the 5 largest economies on the continent. That is South Africa, Nigeria, Egypt, Morocco, and Algeria, which are going to get the lion's share of the amount that comes to the continent, that comes to African countries, about $33.6 billion. But when you look at someone like Zimbabwe is getting the equivalent of about $961 million in SDR. What do we know this money will be spent on? Because again, for many Africans, for many financial analysts, the question is going to be on accountability and transparency, because it's almost no strings attached. I said almost. We'll get to that later, but it's almost no strings attached. So what is Zimbabwe aiming to use their SDR for?
Well, Zimbabwe and most other countries will have to follow the IMF's directives. And I think a lot of it is going to be spent on ability to import vaccines and ability to support imports of key items such as fuel and importation of food. That country allocation you broke down is another problematic thing about the SDR. And not all countries receive the same amount of allocation. In fact, the allocation you receive is proportionate to your shareholding within the fund. All the members of the IMF have a shareholding of the fund. So obviously the wealthier countries have a larger shareholding of the fund. They'll be able to get much more allocation of the SDR. Africa will only receive about 6% of the allocation. So again, it presents another problem in which you have the wealthier countries receiving more of that. And so there's that conversation of how can that reallocation happen, particularly in countries like the US that are already have sufficient domestic stimulus. How can that be reallocated to poorer African countries?
All right, so let's talk about Nigeria before we go on a break. Nigeria is getting about $3.35 billion out of the $275 billion earmarked for developing countries. If you were to advise the Nigerian government in terms of core areas to use this money for, what would your suggestion be?
Well, you really have to look at small business and small enterprise. In most African countries, it's what we call the SMEs, the small medium enterprises, that create jobs and employment, and they often form the backbone, that alongside agriculture. So particularly a country like Nigeria, where there's so much importation of food, and that was never the case many years ago, I think they really need to look at how do you reduce importation of food, how do you create sort of more food surplus domestically, and how do you sort of do value addition and have small businesses being able to come up, because those businesses can create jobs at a much faster rate than government.
Yeah. All right, Ken, let's hold on. We're going to take a quick break. And there's a line of conversation that Ken touched on, and that is the reallocation of SDRs. There has been calls in the recent past for wealthier countries to reallocate the funds they don't need. And aside from that, we'll also look at whether the IMF has an advisory role in capacity when it comes to the allocation of these funds. This is Business Edge, and we're taking a look at how the IMF is allocating the next tranche of special drawing rights. Do stay with us. This is Business Edge on News Central. We're looking at the IMF allocating SDR in this new tranche. Now, we've looked at Nigeria and Zimbabwe. Now, let's focus on a country that has been the focus of a lot of conversation in the recent days, and that is Zambia, with a historic election. My guest is Ken Kichinga. He's joining me from Nairobi, Kenya. And we're looking at what exactly Zambia may be doing with $1.3 billion from the allocation. Now, Ken, a historic election, an opposition figure coming in. The IMF had actually been quite quiet in terms of what they intend to do with the country, waiting out to see the results of the election. But we know that the new president has a tough economic task ahead of him. In terms of this $1.3 billion coming from the IMF, also putting in the fact that Zambia was the first African country to default on their sovereign era loans. 1.3, what is it going to do for Zambia exactly? Is it going to kickstart the economy? Is it going to mitigate the default on their loan repayments? What do you think it's going to?
Well, indeed, this is a new dawn for Zambia with a new president. And obviously, he's attempted the presidency 6 times. So it's congratulations to him. And of course, in his inauguration speech yesterday, he said it will not be easy. As you said, Zambia has been deep in debt and has that unenviable record of being the first country to default on its external debt. So obviously for him, I think the benefits he has is he's a businessman, and hopefully he'll role of business in boosting the economy, and he'll be able to put in place credit, access to credit, particularly to small businesses, to jumpstart the economy. Zambia also has great potential in agriculture, and hopefully him and his ranching background will be able to see the ability to expand ranching and agriculture in Zambia. I think these things, if he can be able to at least make some policy posturing in the first 100 days, I think you'll be able to see even the international community are responding much better.
Okay. So the IMF says they're going to provide a framework for assessing the macroeconomic implications of the new allocation. There's going to look at the statistical treatments and governance and how it might also affect debt sustainability. They're also going to provide regular updates on all SDR holdings, transactions, and trading, and include a follow-up report on the use of SDR in 2 years' time. Do you think that these actions and sort of this oversight that the IMF wants to have now will help us with accountability and transparency, particularly from the African governance side of things?
Well, it can get a bit stifling if these measures start resembling the structural adjustment programs that we are seeing, even in countries such as here in Kenya, where we are seeing universities are really under facing deep cuts. I've never really supported cuts to public budgets, and that's one area the IMF really pushes, because if you look at in Kenya, for example, our public sector to GDP, it's only about 25%. That's much lower than you'd find in the West at 40%, the US or in Japan or in Germany. So the idea of cutting back, because much of that framework that you've spoken to will really be about budget cuts. And budget cuts are austerity measures, and they can have negative effects on an economy. I wish they can speak the language of stimulus. How do we start stimulating access to credit for households and for businesses? Because that's the only way that we can be able to bounce back from this pandemic.
So it seems that you're not in favor of an oversight or an advisory role for the IMF in regards to this, or you're in favor of it, but not as much as they intend to do. Where do you stand? Is there a compromise for you?
Well, there is always a concern that some of these oversight measures can go beyond the economic into even the political, where even sort of like the choices of presidential candidates, in a way, are sort of like not directly influenced, but sort of like nudged on a population. So there is that worry that sometimes the sovereignty of a country can be compromised when there is too much of these frameworks. I think what most countries would like to have is sort of like long-term arrangements in which the IMF is sort of like a partner and not really a master.
So the IMF's managing director says that this allocation, which is the largest in history, as I said earlier, is a significant financial help to countries all over the world. If they use it wisely, it will combat unprecedented crisis that is plaguing the world, we know, because of the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, evaluating the spending pattern of recipients over the years, are you particularly optimistic that this is going to help? However little, a drop in the ocean is still a drop. Do you think that the special drawing rights coming in from the IMF, regardless of the value across board, will in some way positively affect these countries?
I think it will help on the importation side, ability for countries to be able to import key things like machinery, fuel, and food. But I think long term, we want to make most African countries to be net exporters. For a long time, we have been net importers, even of food. And the challenge is when you're a net importer of food, you are sort of beholden to global forces. Right here in Kenya, we import too much wheat from other countries, and it has been a challenge in terms of being able to maintain our food security as a country.
All right, so Ken, let me ask you this. So when it comes to these allocations, we know that they're pegged basically roughly reflecting a country's position in the global economy. And this means that wealthier countries in long run will receive more than low-income countries. And you mentioned that earlier before we went on the break. And we also, of course, mentioned that the 5 largest economies on the continent, South Africa, Nigeria, Egypt, Morocco, and Algeria, will receive much of the funding that comes into the continent. But there are those who propose that system of reallocation, that wealthier countries or high-income countries that don't need as much of this money reallocate what is allocated to them. Did this really get much traction with the IMF and wealthier countries? What do you think in particular of this proposal?
Well, if you really think about the wealthier countries, like the US, they have a powerful Federal Reserve, and they are able to conduct fantastic stimulus for their citizens. So really, their special drawing rights are not as significant to them as in countries like in Africa, where central banks are still at their nascent stage. Many central banks don't really understand the tools of monetary stimulus. So I think there is that sense of maybe there could be that reallocation, but even more profoundly, can we start developing the tools and the training so that most African banks can be able to do their own monetary stimulus during future pandemics?
All right, finally, can I ask this? How much influence, if any, do you think the SDRs may have on the medium-term expenditure framework or even a national budget for any of the African countries that are going to receive from the allocation?
Most countries are still deep in the pandemic, and most countries are, for them, part of the ability to come out of this pandemic has been pegged to vaccine coverage. And that has been a big debate, not just in Africa, but across the developing nations. So I think in the medium term, it has to be how soon can these countries fully reopen? Because even those expenditures that you speak about are tied to whether the economies are partially open or fully open. Right now, in most countries, economies are partially open. So even that expenditure is limited, but that is what is needed. to be able to have cash in circulation and job creations.
All right. We'll pause the conversation here. The SDRs are going to come in. Some have already come in, as we've spoken about, but a lot of oversights, and a lot of people are going to be watching to see what is made. Every single kobo, every single shilling, every single rand counts at this point in time for many African economies. Ken Kijinga, thank you so much for joining me on Business Edge.
Thank you very much.
All right, and that is it on that. The IMF is sending money, according to your position in the global economy, to IMF members. About $33.56 billion is coming the way of the continent, with the 5 largest economies on the continent getting the lion's share. How will they use that money? What is the transparency and accountability involved? And of course, the oversight as well. There are questions that need to be asked, and we'll continue to ask those questions as we see the money being dispersed and used across the continent. You're watching Business Edge. When we come back, we have NC4 to watch, and we will be wrapping things up. And we're wrapping things up with NC4 to watch. Here are a few stories we're keeping our eyes on. We start in the eastern part of the continent, where Kenya is eyeing duty-free access to South Korea, targeting coffee, tea, mate, and spices, which would attract an 8% duty as the benchmark in growing its share of the Korean market. In 2018, the country exported 12% of its coffee to South Korea. Trade and Industrialization and Enterprise Development Cabinet Secretary Betty Maina says the duty disadvantages Kenya's exports, which competes with least developed countries that enjoy duty-free access. Ethiopia and Uganda are among countries enjoying this duty-free access to the South Korean market. Moving on, the South African Special Risk Insurance Association, expects claims related to the unrest in July to amount to 20 billion rand, with 10% of the amount to be paid out by the end of this week. Following the riots, the insurance company says over 95% of all registered insurance claims are being attended to. Mining giant Rio Tinto announced that it has commenced the process of restarting operations at Richards Bay Minerals, its major sand mining venture in the northern KwaZulu-Natal industrial town in South Africa. The restart of operations at RBM, the biggest single employer in the area, is expected to take some time, and the group is yet to lift force majeure declared on customer contracts in June after violence halted operations. And finally, Nigeria has expressed its readiness to partner with the Magnus aircraft manufacturing industry in Hungary to establish an assembling plant and later start aircraft manufacturing in the country. Minister of Aviation Hadi Sirika expressed the government's intention during an inspection visit to the aircraft industry in Pogani, Hungary, and he has been quoted as saying that the aircraft manufacturing would facilitate the growth of the country as a regional aviation superpower. And that's all we have for you today on Business Edge. You can head to our YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and see the biggest financial, economic, and business stories coming out of the continent. Don't forget to tune in 11 a.m. West African time, Monday through Friday, as we take you through the details of those stories. Follow us on social media, download our mobile app, and of course, watch us live as we are on Star Times 274. I'm Tolulokwe Adileru Balogun. Do have a pleasant day.